Welcome to What You Don't Know You Don't Know, the podcast that dives headfirst into the surprising, the overlooked, and the misunderstood. Hosted by a curious duo and one man, one woman, we explore the world's most fascinating ideas hiding in plain sight. From science and religion to politics, psychology, history, and everything in between, we shine a light on the knowledge that's publicly available but rarely discussed. Each episode is a deep but never dull conversation that challenges assumptions, sparks new perspectives, and reveals just how much more there is to know, especially about the things you didn't even know you were missing. Whether you're a skeptic, a seeker, or just someone who loves good conversation, this show will leave you thinking, questioning, and most importantly, knowing.
Okay, picture this. You're at home, right? Maybe you're in the living room and you think, I need to grab that thing from the kitchen. You get up, you walk down the hall, you walk through the doorway into the kitchen, and then bam, standing there. You have absolutely no idea why you came in. Just blank.
Oh, yeah.
It's super frustrating, right? You stand there for a second, maybe look around, hoping it'll just pop back into your head. Has this ever happened to you?
Absolutely. That exact moment of arriving somewhere and poof, your original intention just vanishes. It's incredibly common, I think.
Yeah.
Most people just sort of chalk it up to being tired or distracted, maybe just, having a senior moment or something.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. This isn't just some random personal quirk. It's actually a documented psychological phenomenon.
Right.
Scientists even have names for it. They call it the location updating effect, or maybe a bit more catchily, the doorway effect.
That's right. And the really surprising thing, the core finding from the initial research, is that the simple physical act of walking through a doorway seems to trigger this forgetting.
A doorway? Seriously?
Yeah.
Just crossing a threshold that can make you forget what you were literally just thinking about.
That's precisely what the early data suggested.
Okay. We absolutely have to unpack this. So in this deep dive, we're going to explore the research that first uncovered this, kind of bizarre effect. We'll dive into the main theory explaining why this happens, look at some really clever experiments that tested whether it's just about the physical act or something more, cognitive.
Even imagining doorways.
Right, even exploring if imagining a doorway has the same effect. And then we'll talk about what this tells us more broadly about how our brain and memory actually work, in the context of our environment.
It's a fascinating look, really, how seemingly simple changes in our physical space or even our mental space can significantly impact our cognitive processes.
So where did this all start? Who first noticed that doorways might be, messing with our minds?
The foundational research really came from Gabriel Rodansky and his colleagues. This was at the University of Notre Dame. Starting around, 2006, they conducted a whole series of studies designed to investigate this very thing.
Okay, and what did those early experiments look like? How did they, isolate the effect of just the doorway?
Well, they often use virtual environments, kind of like a simple video game, you could say.
Oh, okay.
Participants would navigate these digital spaces, sometimes on a big immersive screen, sometimes just a standard monitor. And their task was pretty straightforward. Pick up virtual objects, maybe like a green cone or a yellow ball, and carry them somewhere else in that environment.
Right.
Now, in some trials, participants would just walk across one single large room to get to the destination table.
Okay.
But in other trials, they'd walk roughly the same distance. But the path meant going through a doorway into a completely new room before reaching that same table.
And while they were doing this moving around, they had to remember something specific.
Yes, exactly. At certain points, maybe right after picking up an object, or sometimes right after putting it down, they'd get a quick memory test.
Like what?
They'd be asked, what object are you currently carrying? Or what object did you just put down? Simple recognition.
And the key finding. What did they see over and over again?
Consistently, participants were slower and less accurate when asked about an object after they had walked through a doorway into a new room.
Compared to when they just walked the same distance but stayed in the same room.
Exactly. Compared to when they'd traveled the same distance entirely within that one room.
Wow. So the distance wasn't the issue. It was literally crossing that boundary, that threshold.
Precisely. The significant factor was whether they crossed a doorway or not. And they found this effect held true, regardless of the type of VR display.
Okay.
And importantly, they also replicated the effect using actual physical rooms in their lab. People carried real objects in boxes so they couldn't peek. The forgetting effect still happened after passing through a real physical doorway.
Okay, so the data seems pretty clear then. Doorways somehow trigger forgetting. But why? It just feels so counterintuitive that something so everyday would disrupt memory like that.
Right. And this leads us straight to the leading theory, the main explanation, also proposed by Radvansky and his team. It's called the event horizon model.
The event horizon model.
Okay, sounds a bit like something out of science fiction.
It does have a dramatic name, doesn't it? But the core idea, the principle relevant here, is actually quite intuitive once you break it down.
Okay.
The model suggests that our brain doesn't just record experience like a continuous, unbroken video stream. Instead, it actively segments everything that happens to us into these discrete chunks, these event units or event models.
Like mental chapters.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it like your brain organizing your day into distinct scenes or chapters.
So one chapter might be making breakfast, the next is the commute, then that morning meeting, stuff like that. Precisely. And according to this model, a doorway acts as a very strong, very salient cue. It's an event boundary.
A boundary.
Yeah. Crossing that doorway signals to the brain, okay, one event unit in the old context, the room you were just in, is ending, and a new one is beginning in this new context, the room you've just entered.
Okay, I get the idea of a boundary, like closing one chapter and starting another. But how does that specifically lead to forgetting the thing you were thinking about?
Well, think about it. When you carry information like your intention, get the remote, or the object you're holding, or just a thought from the old context, room 1, into the new context, room 2, that piece of information gets associated with both event models, the old one and the new one.
Okay, so get the remote gets mentally tagged with both the living room event and the kitchen event.
Essentially, yes. And later, when you try to access that specific piece of information, why did I come in here? Your brain tries to retrieve it. But because that thought, that intention, is now linked to multiple distinct event models, well, activating one can interfere with accessing the specific detail you need from the other.
So it creates competition. Like trying to find a file that's saved in 2 different folders at once, and the system gets confused.
That's a decent analogy. It creates retrieval competition, making it harder and slower to pull up that specific piece of information. It's similar to something called the fan effect in memory research, where the more things associated with a concept, the harder it is to retrieve any one specific thing.
So the brain is basically trying to be efficient, maybe. It's compartmentalizing information, keeping what seems most relevant to the current event, the current room, easily accessible.
Exactly.
And it pushes information tied to past events, the previous room, kind of into the background. And the doorway is the trigger for this mental filing update, this clearing process.
That's the leading explanation, yeah. It's a mechanism likely designed to manage information overload by prioritizing what's relevant to your current location and task.
But the side effect is that sometimes the thing you needed from the previous event becomes less available. Hence, standing in the kitchen, looking confused.
That's the idea. Usually helpful, sometimes frustrating.
It's still pretty remarkable, though, that a simple doorway has such a consistent effect. You'd think maybe there are simpler reasons, right?
Absolutely. And researchers have definitely been diligent about testing and ruling out those more straightforward alternative explanations.
Like maybe you're just momentarily distracted as you physically walk through the door. Or maybe it's simply that more time has passed.
Well, while general distraction and, the simple passage of time can contribute to forgetting in general, studies have shown the doorway effect seems to be something more specific than just that.
How did they test that?
Researchers like Petitjean and Radvansky explicitly looked into these. In one experiment, for instance, they actually measured the time participants took to travel either across a room or through a doorway.
Yeah.
The travel times were very similar, but the forgetting effect was still there, specifically after crossing the doorway.
Okay, so not just time.
Right. And other work also played around with room size and distance, confirming that it really seemed to be the event structure, the boundary defined by the doorway, not just travel time or distance, that was causing the effect.
What about that idea that memory is just better when you're tested in the same place you learn something? Encoding specificity.
Yes.
If you walked back to the original room, shouldn't the memory just, pop back?
That's a very logical thought, and they tested that too.
Really?
Yeah. They had studies where participants walked through a doorway into a new room and then immediately turned around and went back to the original room before being tested.
And even then?
Even then, they still showed the forgetting effect compared to just staying put.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty strong evidence that it's not just a simple context mismatch. The act of crossing the boundary itself seems to actively mess with accessing the information, even if you go right back.
Exactly. It suggests something more active is happening at the boundary crossing.
And is it possible the effect is just a tiny temporary blip, like a momentary disruption right at the doorway as your brain is processing the shift? Maybe if you just paused for a few seconds after walking through, the memory would recover.
Another good question they looked at. In a different experiment, again, Pettyjohn and Ravansky, they introduced I think it was a 3-second delay before giving the memory test, specifically after the participants had crossed the boundary.
And did that waiting period help?
Nope. The forgetting effect still occurred.
Huh.
So that suggests it's not just some fleeting disruption right at the moment of crossing. It seems more related to the interference that happens later when you try to retrieve the information, because it's now sort of compartmentalized with that previous event model.
So it's not just temporary noise. It's a more fundamental consequence of how the brain organizes information across these perceived boundaries, like a filing system getting updated.
Precisely. The evidence really keeps pointing towards the event boundary, triggering a shift in how information is stored or accessed, leading to difficulty retrieving details from the previous context because of interference from the new context association.
Okay, but this is all based on actually walking through rooms, right?
Yeah.
Whether they're real or virtual.
Mostly, yes.
But if the theory, the event horizon model, says it's about recognizing a salient event boundary, more of a cognitive thing rather than necessarily the physical act or the sensory input, could you potentially forget something just by thinking about walking through a doorway?
That is a fascinating hypothesis, isn't it? And it comes directly out of the event horizon model. And yes, it was explicitly tested.
By who?
A study by Lawrence and Peterson. They specifically wanted to investigate if perceptual information, actually seeing or feeling the doorway, was strictly necessary for the effect to happen.
So their big question was, can you imagine your way into the doorway effect?
Exactly that. In their first experiment, they had participants get familiar with a real room. Sometimes they set it up with a visual doorway just made out of drapery, and sometimes without.
Okay.
Then, while trying to remember an abstract image, participants were simply told to imagine walking through that room.
Just imagine it. And what happened?
The finding was pretty striking. Participants had worse memory for the image if they imagined walking through the room with the drapery doorway compared to when they imagined walking through the room without one.
So just mentally simulating walking through that boundary caused forgetting.
Yeah.
That's kind of mind-blowing.
It really is. Now, Lawrence and Peterson themselves pointed out a couple of potential limitations with that first experiment.
Like what?
Well, for one, people in the imagined doorway condition took slightly longer, on average, to complete their mental walk. So maybe that extra time contributed to the forgetting, right?
Okay, fair point. Longer retention interval.
Right. And also, participants had physically walked through the real room beforehand during familiarization. So maybe during the imagined walk, they were just recalling that physical experience, meaning physical perception was still kind of indirectly involved.
Okay, those are reasonable concerns. How did they address that? Did they do more work?
They did. In their second experiment, they used virtual environments again, but with a really critical difference. Participants only ever saw these virtual rooms from an aerial view, like a bird's eye perspective, during the familiarization phase.
So no walking around in first-person view?
None at all. Then, just like before, participants imagined walking through the virtual room, which was designed either with a doorway or without one, while remembering an abstract image.
Okay, and did the effect still show up, even without any prior first-person experience?
Yes, it did. Once again, participants showed significantly worse memory for the image after imagining walking through the virtual room that had a doorway. And crucially, in this experiment, the imagined walk times were the same in both conditions. So that ruled out the simple time delay explanation.
Right.
And because participants had only seen the rooms from above, they really had to mentally construct the first-person perspective during their imagined walk. There was no physical memory to rely on.
That provides much stronger evidence, then, that you don't necessarily need to physically see or walk through the doorway. Just recognizing or mentally constructing that salient event boundary is enough to trigger the forgetting.
Exactly. And Lawrence and Peterson even noted that the size of the forgetting effect in their imagined virtual experiment, it was around 18% worse memory, was comparable to, or maybe even slightly larger than, Radvansky's original actual virtual walk experiments, which found around 13% forgetting.
That's wild. It really hammers home that it's driven by the cognitive idea of the boundary, the event segmentation, not just the physical act.
It strongly supports that interpretation, yes.
So this whole concept of event boundaries, it's clearly not just about physical doors or moving around in space. It sounds like a much broader principle for how our brain organizes information.
It really is. You see similar kinds of memory disruptions with event boundaries in completely different areas of cognition, like when we're processing narratives, reading stories.
How does that work?
Well, if you're reading about a sequence of events, and then the text includes a phrase like "an hour later" or "meanwhile back at the ranch," those kinds of shifts in time or location or even character focus, they act like event boundaries too.
And that makes us slightly less likely to remember details from the sentence or paragraph right before that shift happened.
Precisely. Research shows that those sorts of narrative boundaries make it just a bit harder to recall specific information from the preceding event unit in the story.
Okay, so that confirms the principle applies way beyond just physical movement. It applies to shifts in time, location, perspective within a story, probably watching films too.
Absolutely. Films, stories, real-life navigation, virtual navigation, even imagined navigation. It's remarkably consistent.
And it's striking that this happens even when the memory load is tiny, right? You said even just remembering one or two objects.
Yes, even with a very small cognitive load, crossing an event boundary can sometimes double or even triple the error rate.
That seems huge. It must have pretty big implications for how our working memory, handles information as we switch between different contexts or tasks all day long.
It really suggests this is a fundamental, maybe even automatic process for managing information flow.
It also makes me think about how we remember our own lives, our autobiographical memory. We often structure our past based on where and when things happen, don't we?
Definitely.
Like we chunk our lives into chapters, high school, college, first job, often linked to specific places or time periods.
That's right. Our personal memories are very often organized around significant events and locations, and much like the doorway effect, shifting mentally or physically between those key contexts can influence which memories from which chapter are most easily accessed at any given moment.
Okay, so let's bring it back home. Let's circle back to that really frustrating moment we started with, walking into a room and totally blanking. Why should you, the listener, really care about all this research into the doorway effect?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that that moment isn't necessarily a sign of sudden memory failure or, that you're losing your mind.
Right. It's not a personal failing.
Exactly. It's more likely your brain's incredibly efficient, even if it's occasionally inconvenient, way of organizing the constant flood of information it deals with. By segmenting your experience into these event units and linking information to specific contexts, your brain is trying to optimize. It's trying to prioritize what information is most likely to be relevant in your current situation.
It really highlights that our thinking, especially memory, isn't happening in a vacuum. It's deeply dynamic and tangled up with the structure of our environment and how we move through it, even if that movement is just in our heads.
Understanding this effect just gives you a different perspective on those everyday memory lapses, doesn't it? It shows they aren't just random errors, but maybe a predictable consequence of a pretty sophisticated system doing its job managing information across changing contexts.
Okay, so just to recap this deep dive then, we've learned that simple transitions, like walking through a doorway, act as surprisingly powerful event boundaries.
And they trigger your brain to update its current event model, effectively compartmentalizing information that was associated with the previous space or context.
And this compartmentalization means that when you try to retrieve information from that old event model while you're in the new context, you run into interference. It makes it harder to access those details from the previous room or the previous situation.
Right. And we saw this effect isn't just about physical doors. The evidence strongly suggests it's driven by the cognitive recognition or even the mental construction of the event boundary itself.
Yeah, happening even in virtual spaces, imagined spaces, and also with non-spatial shifts like those time jumps in stories.
It really seems to be a fundamental aspect of how our memory system works, probably evolved to keep information that's relevant to our immediate environment easily accessible.
So here's maybe a final thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. Now that you know about event boundaries, and how your brain is constantly segmenting your experience. How else might this process be shaping how you perceive and experience and remember everything? Think beyond just physical doors. How often does your brain's event model actually update without you noticing? When you finish reading an article and then switch over to check your email, when you close one app on your phone and open another, when you finish one task at work and immediately start the next, or even just scrolling down a long web page to a completely new section. Just consider how many little event boundaries you might be crossing every single hour, potentially triggering a subtle update, a subtle shift in what information your brain keeps right at the front, all happening completely beneath your conscious awareness.
Well, that's a wrap. Hope you liked the episode. Don't miss out on new episodes of You Don't Know, You Don't Know. New episodes every week. Like and subscribe.